and welcome to this Impact Investing Network webinar on impact measurement. My name's Tan Nguyen and I am the manager at the network. Today we've got myself and David Woods, who also chairs the National Advisory Board, which is the NAB, that governs the activities of the network. So what we'll do, we're going to do a presentation to you right now on impact measurement, and we'll have a Q&A there towards the end. Just letting everyone know that the presentation element will be recorded. What we'll do is just move now into sort of sharing the screen.
I haven't received any reply or anything, but I'm sure you can send it to me. But no, I think that's sorted unless something goes on.
If you could please all just, if anyone hasn't muted, if you could just mute yourselves just during this presentation. And then when we get to the Q&A, please do feel free to help in with any questions there. Just sharing the screen now. David, if you could just give me the thumbs up, that's you can see that. Thank you very much. So just these are the topics that we'll go through today. The impact measurement, a little bit about results-based financing or outcomes-based financing. Also, just to give you, point you in the right direction about some of the education resources, both locally and globally, that you can access post this webinar, and then we'll have a bit of a Q&A. Just a little bit about us. I think most of us on here today know us as the network and the NAB, but really just to remind everyone what we're all about. So as I mentioned, we do have some members of the New Zealand National Advisory Board here, and our role is to govern the strategy and the activities of the Impact Investing Network, which is great because you're all a part of the Impact Investing Network. So our purpose is to contribute to a sustainable, equal, and prosperous Aotearoa New Zealand, and through the growth of impact investment. So in order to do that, we have our priorities are to connect, educate, and advocate, and our aim is to grow that impact investment sector in New Zealand. So what I really would love to do is over the course of the year is to connect with you and to actually help us guide us in terms of under those big buckets of connect, educate, and advocate, what you'd actually like to see and experience from an impact investing network point of view. David, I'm just going to hand over to yourself now and talk about the measurement side of things.
Okay, thank you, Tan, and thank you everybody for joining us. What I'm going to do is simply run through if you like, the state of play where we are in impact measurement at the moment, because as most of you will know, the impetus towards measuring the impact that impact finance has is increasing. It's been the two big global issues for the last year for the Global Steering Group on Impact Investment: measurement of impact and results-based or outcomes-based financing. Some of you who were on a call a few weeks ago with RIA, the Responsible Investing Association for Australasia, will have heard a question come up about net impact, offsetting bad impact and good impact, a bit akin to carbon offsetting in environmental finance, but on a broader scale. That debate is something that is just starting in Australia and overseas, hasn't really started to any great extent here, but there's been a few moves around the world that show people are at least thinking about it. And perhaps one might look at what's happened in Europe with Danone, the big dairy company, where the chief executive, Emmanuel Faber, was, I suppose, in populist terms, the darling of the impact market, and was ousted a couple of weeks ago by activist investors saying he wasn't doing enough on financial results. So you've got two elements going on in this net impact discussion, I think. One is whether you can and should offset impact, good impact with problems, and whether impact and sustainability and ESG work is important enough to offset potentially less good financial results. In the case of Danone and in a few other cases in the US, the activist investor view has started to become no, shareholder returns are primary and ESG is secondary. The sense in Europe is that that's a blip, that we're on the longer term road towards stakeholder capitalism being primary, but it's a road that isn't going to be without bumps. In addition to the situation around Danone, you've seen in the US that if you look at the activities of the Business Roundtable, who made a big splash last year about stakeholder capitalism, not a lot has happened. And if you look at the financial results of those companies, they've done okay, but their ESG results certainly haven't improved in the last year. We also sense, talking to our colleagues at RIA in Australia and at Impact Investing Australia, that there's been a bit of pushback in the Australian market in favour of shareholder primacy. And if you look at some of the pieces written even here in New Zealand, the debate is certainly very much open. You also have a discussion around whether standards and codes of conduct will do the job instead of actual measurement. And that's quite important when you come to social impact investing, where measurement is difficult. So you've seen things come out like the ICME, the International Capital Markets. If I use too many acronyms, please check us afterwards. But the International Capital Markets Association standards on social bonds and on environmental bonds, the EU taxonomy, which has been initially produced as a set of standards for environmental and green bonds, and where the social element is being published at the end of April. UNDP have produced a set of SDG-oriented impact standards for bonds, for private equity, and now for enterprises. That last one is in the final stages of consultation. And the UNPRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, have also made it very clear that they have a set of standards they expect their members to adhere to and report on. Now, in the market, if you create enough standards that your organization or the instruments your organization is involved in are reporting on, then do you really need to have measurement separately from adherence to those standards? I think one of the concerns people have around that is that there are now so many sets of standards emerging in the market. What are we going to finally settle on? And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But one speaker at a conference a couple of days ago said, speaking in Europe, if we think that we've got a lot of regulation in the EU around this, just wait, because it's only starting. So there is a fear, and I think that's something we're potentially likely to see here in New Zealand, that we'll just see a flood of regulation coming in from overseas, which will affect what we do and how we do it, and ultimately may start to determine how we behave, the risk being that it determines how we behave without us having had much of a voice in what's going on. Some of you will be aware that the Reserve Bank here is a member of an international group called Greening the Financial System, which is led by or chaired by the Central Bank of France. And they are introducing a series of climate finance regulations, which may start to affect banks and financial organizations here, but we haven't really had a chance to look at it. I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about global versus local measurements. In the whole issue of social versus environmental measurement, which is where a lot of us started the discussion around, if you measure impact investment, what are we trying to measure? The most vocal body in this has probably been the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative, which comes out of Harvard Business School, and they have published a number of papers on environmental impact. One of the most recent ones is actually called just that, corporate environmental impact. If you go to the IWA's website, you can download that and have a look at what they're trying to do. And they've taken the publicly available data for 2018 of 2,000 international companies, and they've assessed whether those companies would report better results if they took their environmental impact into account. Now, in order to evaluate what they're doing, you have to look at what assumptions they're making, what carbon price they're assuming, what assumptions they make about the impact water pollution may have, and decide whether you think that that's fair or appropriate as a global standard. But they're certainly promoting a pretty big debate, and they're going to produce a new paper in about a month's time on the uses and applications of impact-weighted accounts. They've been working jointly with the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment and with the IMP, the Impact Management Programme in Oxford. And the IMP has, many of you will know it, has a set of principles around which you can build measurement frameworks so that you have a consistent approach to measurement. Possibly the biggest debate in the whole measurement space when you look at social versus environmental measurement is that, in a way, environmental measurement is relatively easy. It's objective, it's scientific. Social measurement tends to be much more subjective, and there is still no universally accepted methodology for doing either, but particularly for social measurement. And the biggest point of contention at the global level in social measurement is whether you should monetize social impact. So if you look at some of the initiatives that have been undertaken in Australia and in the Waikato here with the Huber social measurement philosophy, that doesn't put a monetary value on most social impacts, whereas in many North American situations, there is a desire to put a monetary value on social impact so that mainstream institutional investors can get involved in impact as an asset class, whereas in the past they've held off because most impact instruments up till now have been unlisted and relatively illiquid. And as more and more money goes into impact assets and impact investment, there is a move to try and make it as measurable as possible and as comparable with other assets as people can. So the Impact Weighted Accounts initiative I mentioned is just producing this paper on the uses and applications of impact weighted accounts. They're also introducing something called a Training the Trainer initiative over the next 3 or 4 months, which will train people in the methodology the IWA initiative uses for environmental impact, and therefore allow it to be rolled out on a wider scale. One perhaps slight note of caution on all of that is something which, when they were describing this a few days ago, they talked about how everybody has initiative fatigue around impact measurement. There've just been so many things going on. I talked about the IMP a minute ago and their set of principles for coming up with measurement frameworks. They're about to launch a new website called the IMP Structured Network. I don't have the address to give you right now, but it will be easy enough to find, where they put up a whole set of tools around their IMP impact principles that are designed to help people to measure more easily. In New Zealand, we often have the issue at a relatively smaller and local scale, where we're looking at who should do the measurement, who should decide what to measure, and who pays for that measurement. And we've discussed this a number of times in the NAB, we don't feel that you can simply decide as either the investor or the investee on what you want to measure and how you're going to measure it. It is an iterative process involving both parties and involving somebody who's going to be able to perform the measurement activity. If you look at things like the sustainable loan, I won't call it an impact loan, but the sustainable loan recently done by BNZ for Southern Pastures, which was linked to emissions, or sorry, the interest rate is linked to emissions reduction and water quality, among others. The measurement for that is being provided by Assure Quality. But there are very few in social impact deals in New Zealand. There are very few organizations who are really set up to provide that measurement service. What we have found as the NAB is that often it's one of the auditing firms who's doing it alongside the audit, which is potentially quite expensive, and it's not always going to give a standardized version that will work for everybody. There are a few organizations specializing in impact measurement. We don't really have enough traction in New Zealand to come up with one, but I think the encouraging side is that as impact deals are being put together, people are sitting down and discussing and agreeing on measurement and working out how it should be done. Impact Lab in Wellington has done quite a lot in the social impact space and has, I think, just been nominated for a Public Good Award in New Zealand for their work this year. But they struggle with and I know they wouldn't mind me saying this because I think it's fairly well known, they struggle with the who pays issue, because for Impact Lab to produce an assessment, typically for a not-for-profit, is quite a pricey process. The not-for-profit can't afford to pay for that service. So Impact Lab have been trying to help not-for-profits to find a philanthropic foundation or somebody else that is willing to pay for the measurement service. And that kind of debate is something which is ongoing here in New Zealand, but it's ongoing in other countries as well. And when we talk about results-based finance, we will see a little more around what's going on in that area. I think that if you look at what's going on in New Zealand versus what's going on globally, we're still at a fairly early stage in measurement, but you've got a situation now where within about 2 weeks, the G7 will announce the creation of an impact investing task force with 2 work streams, one on transparency, which is essentially measurement, and one on results-based financing. We don't know who's going to get the mandate to do that work for the G7. The Global Steering Group for Impact Investing hopes it will be them, but it may not be. And whether that will help us towards a standard or not remains to be seen. In the last year, we've had the big 4 accounting firms come together and agree on ESG standards. We have at the moment IFRS, the big accounting body, about to launch a set of standards in sustainability, having had a consulting period over the last 6 or 8 months. And we have the OECD due to announce a set of standards by September. So we're at the point where everything is starting to come together with many large cooperations announced, but we don't yet have a single standard that everybody recognizes. In impact investing, the Global Impact Investing Network has probably gone furthest with their IRIS2 measurement standards, which many institutional investors, both here and overseas, follow. So we could then, if you like to, we could complicate this further by the new climate reporting requirements first announced here in the last couple of days, and look at how all of that is going to develop. But certainly it seems inevitable that impact measurement and reporting on impact effectiveness is something that we're going to have to get quite used to for over the next couple of years. I just want to link this, Tan, if you could move to the next slide, to the results-based financing. The Global Steering Group has produced an extensive guide on tying funding to results. It's free of charge. It's available to any of you who are members of the Impact Investing Network. It's essentially a policy guide, and it's to enable investors or investees or advocacy bodies such as the NAB and the IIN in New Zealand to lobby local and national governments on outcomes-based contracting and outcomes-based funding. In a way, some of us on the NAB felt we missed an opportunity in New Zealand and in many other countries with the COVID recovery financings that were done last year, where there was an opportunity to make that funding linked to certain either measurement outcomes or reporting outcomes or results. So in France, Air France received government aid linked to very strict emissions reductions targets. In Canada and one European country, whose name doesn't come straight away, COVID recovery financing was linked to a requirement that you report in TCFD. Now, since we introduced TCFD for mandatory climate reporting later last year, we perhaps didn't need that link to COVID, but the sense that we perhaps missed an opportunity in many countries to get both governments and the private sector used to financial support from government being linked to outcomes was one that was quite wide. I think that outcomes-based budgeting is something that is becoming more and more talked about, and certainly in Europe done by governments as a logical response to moving towards results-based financing, where governments simply can't afford to finance some of the huge social programs that are needed in different countries, but they can afford to pay for results if other people help them to achieve that progress. So we've seen this in education, we've seen it in healthcare, we've seen it in employment, we've seen it particularly in housing. It's difficult to do. Even in New Zealand, where we have this wonderful data bank and the data availability and the ability to mine that data at a very granular level, we don't have a transfer pricing system where government can say, if better housing improves the outcomes in education and healthcare, we can transfer price money from education and healthcare back to the people who financed the housing in the first place. So we're still at a place where we're structuring, starting to structure transactions around outcomes. It's something where we probably need to get quite a bit better at it. Some of you may have seen large outcomes funds, which have been done internationally for education, for healthcare, and for some developing country regions, such as the Southern Cone in Africa and Latin America. I don't think we're in a position in New Zealand to put up an outcomes fund that is not linked to a specific transaction, where transactions are then launched accessing money from that fund. Typically, those are done with the big multilaterals such as UNDP or the IFC, allowing programs which then draw on that fund as they generate outcomes. But some of the good and interesting examples around employment and education in South America, in parts of India and in parts of East Africa show what is possible in that area. We've got potential opportunities in healthcare here in New Zealand. We've got potential opportunities in improving water quality and in other environmental areas. And it's simply a question of thinking about, well, simply, sorry, it's never simple, but it's a question of thinking about, if we finance this social program or this environmental program, who benefits and how can we measure the results of what we're doing, and how can we tie the people who benefit from getting the funding and the people who benefit from getting an improvement in, for example, water quality, and how do we tie that back so that it is shared. I don't think, as I said, I don't think an outcomes fund would work here, but I think there's a lot of work we could do around specific transactions. And I remember speaking a couple of years ago down in Wanaka, where people were talking about wanting cycle paths and wanting less traffic on the roads. Well, if you want to finance cycle paths in Wanaka on an outcomes base, who benefits from the cycle paths being there? It's the local residents, it's the insurance companies because there are potentially less accidents, it's the tourists who have a better riding experience. Who is prepared to pay for the construction of the cycle paths, and who is prepared to pay afterwards for the results and the benefits of the cycle paths? It's just one example. If we then look for a minute, and then we'll open it up in a minute to questions and discussion, because we'd like to have most of this call more around what other people think. But Tan, if we just go for a minute to education resources, I would encourage everybody to have a look at the website of the Impact Investing Institute in London. And when you go to that website, look at something called their Learning Hub, because that gives a huge library of materials and publications on all sorts of issues in the impact investing space. They're quite willing to share that. They're quite willing. It's a public good initiative, so everybody can access it anyway. But we're looking here in New Zealand at how we might replicate or link to that site and add our own local materials here and use them as the source for global materials. We're looking at it both as the NAB, and we're looking at it as part of the Sustainable Finance Forum and what the new Centre for Sustainable Finance might do. Many organizations are publishing more and more of these frameworks and guidelines. The big banks quite often have their sustainable finance construct. Deutsche Bank, Rabobank, many others have produced these. The Climate Bond Initiative has produced a framework of its own for issuing green bonds. I mentioned the UNDP SDG impact standards earlier, both for bonds, for private equity, and for enterprises. And then you distinguish, of course, between what's available as a public good and what is available in the private sector. Sites like Impact Alpha, the Financial Times Moral Money site, some of the Economist publications, which are only available to subscribers. We try, as the NAB and as the Impact Investing Network, now that we have Tan working with us, we try to post interesting articles there as often as we can, and we try to disseminate material in New Zealand that comes to us from the Global Steering Group on Impact Investing, and where we think it's either interesting or relevant for people here. So I'm going to stop and just open the floor for questions. It's a small enough group that if you want to simply unmute yourself, go ahead. If you want to use the chat function, use that. Or if you want to use the reactions button at the bottom of the screen, which allows you to, well, looking at the symbols available, it doesn't have a raise your hand one, which it does on some of these Zoom webinars, but I'm sure we can spot the people who would like to comment.
Thanks very much for that, David. Just before we move into the discussion and the Q&A, really just wanted to summarise what the things that we have been doing. Really just wanted to say thank you very much to the Community Trust and the foundations out there who have helped sponsor and provide funding so we can do the activities, for example, with this webinar. I think we have some with us today. So thank you very much to the likes of Well Energy Trust and Community Trust South. Thank you very much. So just some of the events that we're going to be, that are upcoming. I think you may be aware of the breakfast that we are going to be hosting on the 2nd of June. It's a breakfast event starting at 7:15 a.m. That's just before the Rio conference, and that's in Auckland. So if you haven't, please register at that link there. And it's all on the Impact Investing Network website. There's a few more places left. We'd love to get your feedback in terms of the activities, the events that you'd like to see and ideas. We'd like to partner with others as well for future events. So please do get in contact with myself there in that email that you see there. You probably know about the website, and we are also on LinkedIn as well. So we'll look to post things on there. If you could help to engage with us on that, that would be fabulous. What I'll do is I'll stop sharing the screen now.